My parents gave my room to my stepsister, but she smashed a wall and ended up paralyzed. Now I'm living my best life, knowing they can't do anything. I want this room. Can't I have it? Victoria, my new stepsister, questioned, pointing to my bedroom. I laughed, believing it was a joke. I have that room from age 6. My mom and I placed butterfly decals on the walls before she died. She was informed the guest room is next door. She faced Dad. Butterfly and pink are my favorites. She entered my bedroom and stroked my mom's antique vanity desk. This suits my cosmetics collection. Please. Also, the guest room has few closets. She smiled sweetly, fakely, and continued. You can consider it your gift to me. New family. New beginnings. I looked at Dad, expecting for him to respond. Anything. Instead, he approached me and asked, would you mind giving up your room for your new sibling? She really wants it. If you agree, I'll give you the garage. Decorate, refurbish, and bring your mom's stuff down there. The garage was roughly 3 times my bedroom, and I was alone on the first level. It was perfect. I smiled and hugged him. Deal. Victoria giggled when she learned I was sent to the garage and instructed me to leave my mom's pink room. It took 4 months to turn that dirty garage into my ideal room. Built-in bookshelves, a reading corner with floor cushions, fairy lights between the rafters, and a workstation with a garden view via our new window. I put a little projector near my bed for movie nights and put photographs of myself and my mom there. All my buddies started going there and schoolmates boast. Victoria's expression darkened as she saw it. She shouted in our parents' room. I have a bedroom while she has a studio. She said, this isn't fair. I'm the new sibling. I should get the nice things, right? My stepmom groaned and glanced at my dad. Maybe we can move rooms one final time. Dad didn't cave this time. She spent her own money decorating and remodeling the room. The garage is hers. You get your requested pink bedroom. Discussion over. Victoria hyperventilated after losing. She paused. Fine. Keep your stupid garage. Not needed. That seemed to conclude it. For 2 weeks, Victoria obsessively improved the pink room. She bought pricey professional LED strips that synced to music, put a built-in vanity, and set a small bar outside her room to outdo my garage. Dad had to use his credit card to pay her ideas to preserve the peace, but nothing seemed to please her. She'd pull visitors upstairs to show them her renovations, then storm away when they demanded to see the legendary garage room. She realized she needed more room for her. Creativity. Victoria faked illness and remained home as my parents and I celebrated my cousin's graduation. She watched from the window as we drove away before taking a sledgehammer into her room and smashing the wall between the pink and guest bedrooms to make one big room. For 4 seconds, the pink guest room wall fell like she planned. Then the unsupported ceiling beam moved. The neighbors heard lightning-like cracking. Drywall, insulation, and a huge ceiling joist collapsed. Victoria glanced up to see it approaching, but couldn't dive quickly enough. She was trapped by the beam at her skull base. She was awake and screaming for aid, but we were hours from home. She was stuck for 4 hours before our neighbors contacted 911. She repeated, I can't feel anything, the paramedic remarked. We arrived 7 hours later and waited at the hospital for surgery. Doctor left after an hour to confirm. Victoria would never lower her neck again. She'd need a ventilator to breathe. 24-hour care. She will never walk or do anything independently again at 19. When she could talk via the ventilator, she requested to see me. She could seek comfort or assistance. She muttered, You made me feel like I had to compete for space in my own house. I'll never paint my nails, try on clothing, or use a phone again. I simply wanted to join in the family. Stepmom blamed me and Dad, asking, Why couldn't you have shared your room? Why didn't you offer to paint her bedroom when you saw how much she desired a cool room? The top level was locked off. Victoria moved into the garage because it was the only space large enough for all her medical equipment. I thought that was the end until yesterday, when an insurance investigator called to say they found something odd in Victoria's search history the week before her paralysis. I'm headed to the police station. The ventilator made its usual whooshing sound every few seconds, and I'd been counting the cycles without thinking about it. I grabbed my phone and saw a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Ethan Parker from the insurance company, sounding polite and scripted. He said they were reopening the case and needed me to come to the police station this afternoon to answer some questions. My hands started shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone. I said, Okay, and wrote down the address. even though I already knew where it was. After hanging up, I stared at Victoria's face. Her eyes were closed, and she looked peaceful, which felt wrong given what I just heard. I stood up too fast and felt dizzy. I went into the kitchen, where Dad was drinking coffee and Rebecca was making toast, and told them about the call. Rebecca's face went white for 2 seconds, then to angry. Her voice got louder as she demanded to know what lies I'd told the insurance company to make them suspicious. Dad just stared at his coffee mug like it had answers written on the bottom. He said we should cooperate fully, give them whatever they need. His voice was flat and exhausted, like he'd used up all his energy just getting through the past few weeks. Rebecca started arguing, but Dad held up his hand, and she stopped. I grabbed my jacket from the door hook and found my keys in my backpack, got in my car, and drove to the police station. While passing my old high school, I remembered how great I felt a few months earlier when I finished the garage makeover and had all my friends over. The fairy lights shone off the new window and made everything lovely. Everyone kept saying it was the coolest room they'd ever seen, better than anything on Pinterest or Instagram. They took pictures and posted them with captions about how lucky I was. That pride felt poisonous now, sitting heavy in my chest. Maybe I had shown off too much. Maybe I pushed Victoria over some invisible edge by having something she wanted so badly. I parked in the police station lot and turned off the engine. I sat there for 5 minutes trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking. I kept thinking about what search history they could have found to reopen the case. I finally got out of the car and went inside. I sat down and tried to remember the collapse day. We left at noon for my cousin's graduation ceremony. Victoria said she had a headache and wanted to stay home. I remembered her watching us pack the car from her bedroom window. The neighbor's frantic call came around 4 p.m. After hearing a huge cracking sound and seeing dust from our upstairs windows, the paramedics told us Victoria had been trapped for at least 4 hours, conscious and terrified, unable to move or call for help. Thinking about those 4 hours, what she must have felt lying there, knowing something was horribly wrong with her body, turned my stomach. About 10 minutes later, Detective Olivia Cruz came out and walked straight toward me. She introduced herself as Detective Olivia Cruz and shook my hand firmly. Her eyes were kind but serious. She led me down a hallway to a small interview room that smelled like old coffee and cleaning solution. I accidentally touched the metal, cold table. She brought me a chair and sat across the table, explaining that this was an informative interview and that I may have a parent or attorney present. Detective Cruz pulled out a notebook and asked me to describe the family dynamics before the accident. I tried to explain how Rebecca always took Victoria's side in every argument or disagreement. How Dad attempted to preserve peace by giving in to Victoria, even when it wasn't fair. How I felt squeezed out of my own family when they were married. My voice trembled as I recounted my mom's butterfly decals we made when I was tiny. Victoria covered them with her expensive LED strips that synced to music. The detective took notes without looking at me, just nodding occasionally. She asked when things started getting worse between us. I explained about the garage trade and how Victoria got angrier after seeing how nice I made it. Then she asked about the garage renovation costs and timeline. I told the detective I'd saved 8 months of paychecks from my part-time library job, bought the materials at Home Depot, and decorated mostly alone. Dad helped with the window installation on weekends because it required actual construction work. The detective wrote something down and asked if we got window permits. My chest tightened because I didn't know. I told her Dad handled that part, or at least I thought he did. I worked on making everything seem lovely while he handled the formal stuff. She made another note and my anxiousness rose. Detective Cruz turned her iPad toward me. She showed me a preliminary report from Ethan Parker, the insurance investigator, and explained that routine device forensics revealed search history that raised red flags. Insurance companies check devices and major structural damage claims to rule out fraud. I nodded, even though I didn't understand why this mattered for Victoria's accident. She looked silly attempting to bring down a wall. The investigator turned the tablet toward me and showed me Victoria's laptop search phrases from 6 days before the fall. My blood went cold. Each search term felt like a punch. She asked if I knew Victoria was planning any construction projects. I shook my head and the room spun a little. I told Detective Cruz that Victoria never wanted to demolish walls, just buy decorations and complain that her room wasn't big enough to compete with mine. He asked me to walk through the day of the accident again, specifically what time we left and who knew we'd be gone. I told her we left around noon for the graduation party. Victoria knew because she'd watched us pack the car from her bedroom window. I remember her face in the glass looking pale and unhappy. I thought she was mad about missing the party, but now I wonder if she was nervous about what she was planning to do. Detective Cruz shifted in her chair and pulled up a new tablet screen. She asked if I hired contractors or did all the garage renovation work myself. I told her I bought the materials and decorated, painting the walls and installing the shelves and fairy lights on my own. Dad helped with the window, which required cutting through the wall and framing it. She nodded and wrote something down, then asked who did the electrical work for all the lights and the projector outlet. I told the investigator Dad ran new wiring from the house's main electrical panel, and the detective glanced up and asked whether we had building permits. I didn't know, so my stomach fell. She made more notes on her tablet and said the insurance company would need to verify that all the work was done legally and up to code. I got sweaty palms because I wasn't sure Dad had gotten permits. Detective Cruz closed that screen and opened another, asking whether Victoria ever threatened to harm or destroy my garage. I shook my head and answered no, nothing like that. She regularly complained about how unfair the room arrangement was, how I had this vast space while she was confined in an ordinary bedroom. We didn't fight, just average step-sibling tension and passive-aggressive remarks when her friends were over. The detective asked if Rebecca ever suggested Victoria should get the garage instead of me. I didn't want to call Rebecca out, but he was waiting for an answer. I admitted that Rebecca often complained about me having too much space, saying things like it wasn't fair that one kid got a studio apartment while her daughter had to fit everything into a bedroom. She never said Victoria should take the garage from me, but she implied I was selfish for keeping such a large space to myself. The detective's voice quieted and she asked me to repeat what Victoria said at the hospital when she accused me. Victoria claimed I made her feel useless and invisible, that she only wanted to belong in the family, but I had to have the coolest room and all the attention. I started shivering because I wondered if she was correct, if I had been showing off with the garage and pushed her into doing something desperate. Detective Cruz softly asked whether I thought I caused the accident. I responded I didn't know anymore. Everyone kept saying if I had shared my room or helped Victoria decorate hers, none of this would have happened. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was selfish and needed to be a better sister. Detective Cruz closed her iPad and laid it on the table between us. She said there could be several legal issues around the demolition depending on what the full investigation revealed. If Victoria intended to damage the house, that could be one thing. If my garage renovation was done without permits, that was a code violation. If anyone else planned or knew about the demolition, that raised other questions. Even if Victoria only endangered herself by knocking down a load-bearing wall, reckless endangerment was serious. When I realized she was talking about criminal charges, my mouth dropped. I asked if Victoria could go to jail, and the detective said probably not given her current condition, but the family could face fines and legal consequences. Rebecca could face issues if she knew about or encouraged the demolition plan. The detective asked if I would consent to having my phone and laptop examined by their tech team to verify that I wasn't involved in Victoria's plans. I agreed immediately, unlocking my phone and sliding it across the table. I also gave her my laptop password, desperate to prove I didn't know what Victoria was planning. Detective Cruz thanked me and said a tech specialist would make copies of everything and return my devices within 48 hours. She stood up and shook my hand again, saying I was free to go and they would be in touch if they had more questions. I grabbed my keys and left the interview room, my legs shaky and weird. I left the police station at 6 p.m., hands still trembling as I unlocked my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, just breathing, trying to process everything the detective said about permits, fraud, and criminal charges. I texted Dad that the interview was over, but it was intense. He responded an hour later with, "Okay," and nothing else. No inquiries about what they requested or how I felt. I went home, stopped into our driveway, and sat for 20 minutes watching the garage lights shine through the glass. The space that had made me proud now seemed wrong. The next morning, I was pouring cereal in the kitchen when Dad's phone rang. He answered and his face went from confused to pale as he listened to the caller. After he hung up, he told me and Rebecca to sit at the table. Dad's voice was flat as he read from his notes from the conversation. Victoria had inquired, "How long does an insurance claim take? What happens if you destroy a house without a permit, and does homeowners insurance cover accidental demolition?" Rebecca started crying immediately, saying Victoria couldn't have understood what those searches meant. She was just a kid researching random things. But I could see in Dad's face that he knew what I knew, that Victoria had been planning this and thinking about the insurance angle. Later that morning, Ethan sent a follow-up email with more details from the forensics report. Dad opened it on his laptop, and we all crowded around to read. Victoria had also searched, "Can you get in trouble for knocking down the wrong bar?" and structural damage insurance payout average, 2 days before the disaster. This indication that Victoria had thought through the repercussions and bet that Dad's insurance would heal anything went wrong made me ill. Victoria planned her sledgehammer grab and calculated that insurance would save her if things went wrong, according to the investigator's report. The morning of the accident, when we left for my cousin's graduation, Victoria had searched how to fake being sick convincingly and best excuses to skip family event before telling us she had a headache. Dad read this part out loud and Rebecca muttered. Victoria had planned, researched and prepared for this whole thing, but she was 19 and probably thought she could just knock down a wall and have a bigger, cooler room by the time we got home. I spent the afternoon in my car in the library parking lot where I used to work before everything happened. She didn't plan to become paralyzed or have the ceiling collapse on her, so I wasn't sure if knowing she planned it made it better or worse. My phone buzzed around 7 o'clock that evening while I was still in the parking lot, and Detective Cruz's name lit up the screen. I answered, and she said the neighbors had given another statement about something they remembered from 3 days before the accident. A delivery truck had dropped off a package at our house, and the neighbor watched Victoria sign for it through their kitchen window. Detective Cruz asked if Dad had ordered anything recently, and I put her on speaker so I could drive home. He scrolled through his laptop's order history from the past month, shaking his head. No sledgehammer, no tools, nothing heavy delivered to the house. Detective Cruz speculated that Victoria had ordered the sledgehammer herself using someone else's account or card, planning the demolition days in advance. The detective noted that the neighbor's statement showed clear preparation, not a sudden angry impulse. Victoria had time to think about what she was doing and time to stop, but she ordered the tool and waited for it. The neighbor also reported the sounds they heard the day everything happened. Detective Cruz read from her notes, explaining how the neighbor was doing dishes around 1 p.m., when they heard music playing upstairs at our house, loud enough to hear through the walls. At first they thought Victoria was just being a teenager blasting music while we were gone, but around 1:30, they heard rhythmic pounding, like someone hammering on something hard. The neighbor almost went over to check, but they thought Victoria was hanging pictures or doing a craft project. The pounding stopped and started for over 2 hours, and the neighbor got used to it. Then at 3:30, they heard a massive cracking noise that shook their whole house, followed by a huge crash, and then silence. They called 911. I imagined Victoria swinging that sledgehammer for hours, taking breaks when her arms got tired, then starting again. My throat tightened as I thought about how someone could have stopped her if they'd just knocked on the door, or if the neighbor had trusted their gut and checked on the noise, but nobody did, and she kept going until the ceiling fell on her. Detective Cruz called us again 2 days later with more bank records. Rebecca had given them permission to look at her credit card statements, probably thinking it would clear things up. Instead, they found that Rebecca's card was used to buy the vanity, LED strips, and sledgehammer from the same hardware store over 3 weeks. Rebecca turned white when she saw the printed statements when the detective came to the house to talk to us about it. She claimed she never approved buying a sledgehammer and only knew about the vanity and lights because Victoria showed her after they arrived. She also claimed that Victoria must have taken her card from her purse and used it without asking, since they lived together. But Dad looked at Rebecca differently after hearing this, his eyes narrowed and his jaw tight. I could see him doing the math in his head, wondering how much Rebecca actually knew, and how much she was pretending not to know. The detective said the credit card records supported the theory that Victoria prepared everything she needed over weeks, not days. Detective Cruz then showed us text messages from 8 days before the accident between Rebecca and Victoria from Victoria's phone backup. Rebecca wrote, "You need to make it impossible for them to ignore how unfair this is." Victoria replied, "I have a plan." Rebecca sent additional comments about how I got everything I wanted and Victoria got leftovers. Victoria sent back room design screenshots with captions like, "This is what I deserve and why does she get the cool space?" Rebecca broke down as she read her own remarks on the detective's screen and cried, stating she merely meant Victoria should decorate more and make her room lovely, not pull down walls. Detective Cruz said calmly that the text messages encouraged Victoria to escalate the situation, even if Rebecca didn't know the plan. Victoria felt justified in taking extreme action because her mom kept telling her she deserved more. Sitting there listening to all this, I started remembering things differently. Rebecca insisted Dad fund Victoria's room improvements, saying, She needs to feel equal in this family, and you can't let one daughter have everything while the other has nothing. I thought she was protecting her child, who felt left out. But now, I could see how she fed Victoria's anger and made it grow bigger, validating every complaint and making it seem like I was the enemy. Rebecca never once suggested that Victoria should be grateful for having a nice room at all, or that maybe comparing ourselves constantly was unhealthy. Instead, she kept pointing out everything I had that Victoria didn't, keeping score like we were in some kind of competition. I felt this flash of real anger at her, hot and sharp in my chest, because she helped create this whole disaster by telling Victoria she was right to feel cheated. On day 4 of the investigation, a woman, named Sarah Matthews, showed up at our house with a clipboard and a serious expression. She introduced herself as a structural engineer hired by the insurance company to assess the damage and figure out exactly what happened. Dad let her in and she went straight upstairs to the sealed-off area, spending the next 3 hours up there. I could hear her walking around, taking measurements and occasionally talking into a voice recorder. When she returned downstairs, her face looked grim, and she asked if we could all sit in the living room. She spread out photos on the coffee table of the collapsed ceiling and the demolished wall, then pointed at them while she talked. The wall Victoria knocked down was load-bearing, supporting the second-floor ceiling joists. Without it, the structure above it would collapse. Sarah Matthews explains that our house was built in 1987 with a structural design that supported the roof and second floor. She showed us the city's original building plans and showed us how the pink bedroom guest room wall was marked as structural, not decorative. She asked Dad if he'd gotten any permits for alterations upstairs, and Dad's face flushed red as he admitted he didn't think permits were needed for interior cosmetic changes like paint and decorations. Sarah said that demolishing any wall, especially a load-bearing one, required permits, and that the ceiling beam had to carry too much weight and collapsed within hours. The engineer walked through the first floor and stopped in my garage space, looking around carefully. She stopped at my window, which Dad and I installed so I could see the garden, and asked when we put it in and if we got a permit. Performing it without approval was a serious code violation that put everyone in the house at risk. Dad's face turned red to purple, and he stammered that he didn't get a permit, thinking the window was small enough. Sarah wrote on her clipboard that adding any opening to an exterior wall required a permit because it affected the building envelope and could cause structural or moisture problems. She said the city would likely require us to get permits for both violations now. Dad just nodded, looking defeated, while I felt sick thinking about how much this was all going to cost. A few days later, a hospital social worker named Lucas Harper arrived to follow up on Victoria's home care situation and make sure we had what we needed. Lucas, likely in his 40s, reviewed Victoria's equipment for an hour, including the ventilator humming in the corner, the feeding tube supplies on shelves, and the adjustable bed taking up most of the garage. He asked about our daily routine, who was doing what care tasks, and how we were managing overnight. Then he sat down with all 3 of us and gently said that this arrangement wasn't sustainable long-term without professional nursing support. Rebecca snapped that we were doing our best with no help and no money. Lucas held up his hands and said calmly that he understood. Rebecca stayed in the kitchen after Lucas left instead of checking on Victoria. As I got a glass of water, I heard her start crying. She leaned against the counter and said she'd lost her beautiful upstairs bedroom and now lived in a house that felt like a hospital with machines beeping all day and night. Then she looked at me with red, swollen eyes and said the garage was supposed to be my punishment for being selfish, a way to teach me I couldn't always get what I wanted. Instead, it became Victoria's prison, the only room big enough for all her equipment, and her daughter would spend the rest of her life there. I stood there holding my water glass, not knowing if I should say something comforting or just walk away, feeling a strange mix of sympathy and anger that she was still punishing me. I walked away without saying anything and went to my temporary sleeping space in the den, feeling a heavy chest pressure that made it hard to breathe. My phone buzzed around 11 p.m., saw Lucas's name on the screen, and I responded while staring at the ceiling in the dark. His calm, attentive voice inquired how I was handling everything, and I admitted that everyone appeared to blame me for not sharing my room from the start. I told him how Rebecca kept saying I should have helped Victoria decorate and how Dad occasionally looked at me like I could have avoided this, but I spoke too quickly. Lucas let me finish before gently saying that Victoria made her own choices and that I was allowed to feel hurt by being made the scapegoat. Hearing that from someone outside the family made my throat tighten, and I had to swallow hard before I could thank him and hang up. The next morning, Detective Cruz called Dad's phone and asked us to sit down in the living room because she had another finding. Cruz explained that Victoria's phone had a draft Instagram post dated the morning of the accident, and she read the caption aloud. Room transformation reveal coming today, with hashtags for home renovation and room makeovers. Rebecca perched on the couch, looking defensive. The detective said Victoria planned to film the demolition and post it as a dramatic before and after story. I felt sick thinking about Victoria setting up her phone to record, expecting to show off some amazing renovation instead of being paralyzed. Rebecca choked and covered her mouth with both hands. Detective Cruz pulled up something else on her tablet and said Victoria had written a video script. Why not go large when my dad's insurance can fix anything? The detective explained this showed Victoria's magical thinking about insurance, how she believed it would cover any damage without real consequences. I sat there angry at how stupid Victoria was and sad that she thought this would work out fine. Dad's face went pale and he shook his head slowly like he couldn't process what he was hearing. Rebecca started crying again, these quiet tears running down her face while she stared at the floor. Detective Cruz then turned to Rebecca and said the text messages showed something else important. When Victoria expressed doubts about the plan, Rebecca wrote back that Dad's insurance was really good and she shouldn't worry. Rebecca snapped up and said she didn't know Victoria was planning to demolish anything, that they were just talking about decorating ideas. But the detective calmly said the text created an environment where Victoria felt protected from consequences and believed insurance would magically fix whatever went wrong. Dad looked at Rebecca with a look I'd never seen before, like he was seeing her for the first time and didn't like what he saw. The room went quiet except for Victoria's ventilator humming from the garage. After Detective Cruz left, Dad walked out to his car and sat there. I watched him through the window before going back to my homework. Rebecca went to check on Victoria, leaving me alone in the home feeling like everything was breaking apart slowly. Dad came inside after dark and claimed he wanted to sleep because he couldn't handle anything. The next day at school, I saw that my friend group had shrunk to just 2 people who still sat with me at lunch. Everyone else found reasons to be busy or just walked past without making eye contact. Between classes, I heard whispers about the paralyzed stepsister and the garage room drama. Someone had spray-painted garage influencer on my locker in silver paint, so I had to get the janitor to help me scrub it off while other students stared. I ate lunch in my car for the rest of the week, sitting in the parking lot with a terrible sandwich. I seriously considered transferring to a different school for senior year, thinking I could start over somewhere nobody knew about this. A week after the big meeting with Detective Cruz, the neighbors gave another statement to the police. Dad got a call to come down to the station, and when he did, his face was gray and tired. He told us the neighbors had seen Rebecca carrying paint samples and measuring tape upstairs 3 days before the accident, talking with Victoria about making the space work better. Detective Cruz asked Rebecca about this, and Rebecca admitted she was helping Victoria plan the layout for a combined room, but she swore she didn't know about the demolition plan. Dad repeated the detective's words about how the pattern of enabling was becoming impossible to deny. 2 days later, Ethan Parker from the insurance company called while we were eating dinner. Dad put him on speaker, and Ethan's careful, formal voice filled the kitchen. He said the insurance company was likely denying the structural damage claim because the demolition was intentional and done illegally without permits. Dad's face went gray as he asked about appeals and exceptions, but Ethan kept explaining the policy language in his calm, professional voice. I watched Dad's hands start shaking as he wrote notes, and his handwriting got messier as the call went on. The next morning, the insurance company sent an official letter confirming they would continue covering Victoria's medical care and equipment under the health policy, but we were responsible for the home repair costs. Ethan Parker called again to walk through the numbers, estimating $80,000 to $120,000 to properly repair the upstairs structure, plus city fines for unpermitted work. Dad slumped in his chair with his head in his hands and shoulders bowed forward, as if to shrink. Rebecca began inquiring about payment plans and loans, her voice growing more anxious with each statement. I excused myself and went to my temporary sleeping space, closing the door on their voices. That night, I lay awake in the den, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the times Rebecca had pressured Dad to give Victoria the garage. She said things like, "You're choosing your daughter over my daughter." I debated telling Detective Cruz about those conversations to add to the evidence of Rebecca's push and enablement of this disaster, but I didn't want to make things worse for a family that was already falling apart. I kept debating if remaining silent was shielding individuals who had blamed me for everything, or if speaking up was retribution disguised as honesty. The next morning, Detective Cruz phoned to urge us to return to the station. Dad and Rebecca rode together while I drove alone, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. We sat in the same interview room when Detective Cruz pulled out her tablet again, her face serious. She said they found more messages on Rebecca's phone, these ones to her sister from 3 weeks before the accident. First communication from Rebecca. Maya must do something drastic to show them how unjust this is. A big gesture that forces change. Her sister replied, "Be careful what you encourage." Rebecca's response made my stomach drop. Sometimes you have to shake things up to get results. I felt sick reading it, but also relieved because it proved Rebecca had pushed this whole thing. Dad's face went pale, and he looked at Rebecca like he didn't recognize her. Rebecca started crying and said she didn't mean Victoria should destroy anything. She just wanted her to speak up more. Detective Cruz let her finish, then explained that while the messages were bad, proving criminal intent for insurance fraud or contributing to minor delinquency required Rebecca to know about the demolition plan. The texts showed bad judgment and enabling behavior, but the burden of proof was high, and prosecutors were unlikely to charge a mother whose daughter was paralyzed. The detective's voice was kind but firm, like she wanted us to understand the legal reality, even if it felt unfair. Dad asked if Rebecca wouldn't face any consequences, and Detective Cruz said they were already happening, just not criminal ones. We drove home in silence, and I went straight to my temporary room in the den. 2 days later, Jason Taylor from the city building department knocked on our door with a clipboard to inspect the property after the structural collapse report. Jason spent an hour upstairs inspecting the sealed-off area, taking photos and making notes. When he came down, he handed Dad a violation notice listing unpermitted demolition upstairs and unpermitted window installation in the garage. He explained that wall removal required permits and inspections, and adding a window to an exterior wall needed approval. He outlined a plan where we had to hire a. Dad's hand shook as he signed the notice, and Jason said he was sorry, but the city had to enforce the codes. After he left, Dad sat at the kitchen table staring at the violation notice, doing math in his head to figure out how much it would cost. Rebecca came downstairs and asked what happened. When Dad showed her the notice, she started crying again, saying they couldn't afford it. I went back to my room because I couldn't handle watching them fall apart. The next afternoon, hospital social worker Lucas Harper returned. He brought a thick folder of paperwork and sat down with us in the living room to explain his care plan proposal, which included 12 hours of Medicaid-covered in-home nursing care from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Family members would have to work the remaining shifts overnight, but he had trained us. Lucas told Rebecca and Dad about ventilator management, feeding tube care, and how to position Victoria to prevent bed sores. The training began next week and required 45 hours of classroom and practical work. Dad took notes while Lucas talked, asking about schedules and what happened if someone got sick. Rebecca sat quietly, not asking anything. Dad and I attended the first caregiver training class at the hospital the following Tuesday. Rebecca called that morning to say she was unwell. Lucas left copies of all the papers and said he'd call in a few days to check the schedule. The instructor, a 20-year ventilator nurse, had us practice on mannequins to suction Victoria's breathing tube when secretions built up. I felt awkward holding the suction catheter and worried I'd hurt someone. Dad's hands shook the whole time, but he kept trying and asking the instructor to show him again when he made a mistake. We learned how to check the ventilator settings, understand the alarms, and respond to problems. The instructor made us practice each skill until we could do it without thinking. After the 3-hour session, my back hurt from bending over the mannequin. Dad thanked the instructor and wrote down the next session's date in his phone. I was exhausted, and Detective Cruz was waiting by my car. She wanted to catch me alone. She whispered, "Keep track of any concerning interactions at home just in case." I knew she was worried about Rebecca's blame patterns worsening. I nodded and said I would. That night, I opened a new note on my phone and titled it Journal, adding the date to the first entry. I wrote down what Rebecca said that morning about being too sick for training and how she blamed me again yesterday for making Victoria feel competitive. It felt weird documenting my family like suspects, but Detective Cruz wouldn't have suggested it without a reason. 3 nights later, Victoria's ventilator alarm beeped. I got up and went to the garage, my eyes adjusting to the dim health equipment glow. Victoria was awake and watching me as I approached. I examined the ventilator display and noticed it was only a position alert. She muttered via the speaking valve that she didn't think the ceiling could fall. She said she wanted a bigger room like mine and thought Dad's insurance would fix any small problems. Then her face hardened, and she said she wouldn't have felt so desperate to compete if I hadn't made such a big deal about the garage. I didn't argue or defend myself, just adjusted her pillow and reset the alarm. As I moved around the bed, her eyes followed me, and I wondered if she believed what she was saying, or if it was easier to say than the truth. Walking back to the den, I realized Victoria's blame was the only way she could cope with being trapped in a body that didn't work anymore. She couldn't accept that her own choices did this because that would mean she destroyed her own life for nothing. It was easier to blame me, to have someone to be angry at instead of drowning in regret. I wrote this in my journal, noting the time and what she said. Dad consented to meet with Grace Walker, a family attorney, 3 weeks after my initial police interview. Her office was in a huge downtown building with big windows overlooking the city. In her conference room, she read through all the evidence we brought, text messages, violation notices, insurance denial letter, for an hour before telling us criminal charges were unlikely. The optics were terrible, but she continued. We should expect the insurance denial to stand. Child Protective Services may provide family support if the city fines proceed. Grace told Dad we could appeal, but the insurance policy language was clear about intentional damage. She then explained our options for city violations and how to work with CPS if they showed up. I made a decision right then and interrupted Grace. I told her everything about Rebecca's pressure tactics, how she'd pushed Dad to give Victoria the garage and enabled every escalating demand Victoria made. Dad looked uncomfortable, but I kept talking about how Rebecca made Dad feel bad for having limits, and how she supported Victoria's pricey room upgrades while complaining that I had too much space. Grace noted that this context was important for understanding family dynamics, even if it didn't change the legal outcome. She suggested family mediation once the crisis stabilized, saying we needed a neutral third party to help work through all the blame and resentment. Dad agreed to consider it and we scheduled another meeting for 2 weeks later. 3 days later, Detective Cruz called while I was making lunch and asked if we could all come in Friday at 2 p.m. for a final meeting about the investigation. She said representatives from the insurance company, city building department and social services would present their findings and recommendations. I told her we'd be there and hung up, feeling weird like this was the last chapter of something, but I didn't know if it ended well or badly. Dad took the day off work for the meeting, and we drove to the police station in silence, Rebecca staring out the window. Detective Cruz sat at the head of the conference room with her tablet and documents laid out in front of her. It was larger than the interview room. Detective Cruz thanked everyone for coming and said she wanted to walk through the timeline so everyone understood what happened and why. She pulled up her tablet and turned it toward us. She said Victoria researched load-bearing walls and sledgehammer demolition 6 days before the collapse, insurance coverage for accidental damage 2 days later, and how to fake being sick convincingly the morning of the collapse. Detective Cruz spoke calmly, presenting facts without judgment. She presented the neighbor's sledgehammer delivery testimony and the demolition schedule, showing how Victoria smashed the wall for nearly 2 hours before it fell. She then pulled up the text messages between Rebecca and Victoria, in which Rebecca wrote about making it impossible to ignore how unfair things were and told Victoria not to worry about insurance. Rebecca sat still next to Dad, her hands folded on the table, not looking at the screen. Dad took out a pen and started writing on a legal pad, shaking his hand so much that his writing was unclear. Ethan explained that the insurance company was denying the structural damage claim because of intentional demolition and unpermitted work. He said the policy clearly excluded coverage for damage caused deliberately by household members, even if they didn't understand the consequences. His voice was matter of fact, not mean, but not sympathetic, explaining business decisions. Jason listed the city breaches, including unpermitted upstairs demolition and garage window construction. We'd need a certified contractor, permits, and 90 days to bring everything up to code. He gave Dad a stack of documents to complete and fined him $4,000 plus cleanup. I saw Dad write numbers and dates on his notepad like he was solving a math problem. Detective Cruz cleared her throat and explained the police were not recommending criminal charges after analyzing all the information. She said Victoria's actions were reckless and poor judgment, but she was already facing life-changing consequences that were worse than any criminal penalty. The detective said there wasn't enough evidence that Rebecca knew about the demolition plan, just that she encouraged Victoria's general escalation. Ethan confirmed that Victoria's health insurance coverage would continue, so everything Jason added that the city wouldn't pursue additional penalties if we started remediation within 30 days. I felt like I wanted someone to be punished but didn't want things to get worse. Lucas set his bag on the table and said he needed to address something based on the investigation into our family situation. He said he was referring us to Child Protective Services for voluntary support services, not as punishment, but to make sure everyone had access to counseling and help working through everything. CPS could connect us with family therapists, support groups, and resources for managing the stress of caring for Victoria. Rebecca's face crumpled and she started crying, her shoulders shaking as she covered her mouth with both hands. She wanted her daughter to be happy and feel like she belonged in the family. Detective Cruz gently handed Rebecca a box of tissues across the table, saying she understood this was hard for everyone. Dad put his hand on Rebecca's shoulder, but she shrugged and kept crying. After the meeting, everyone handed Dad their reports and paperwork, piling them in front of him until there was a tiny mound. We rose up to leave, and I took my jacket from my chair to return to regular air. Rebecca grabbed my arm and spun me around as we walked through the parking lot to our car, yelling that I was selfish and showing off with the garage that I made Victoria feel so worthless she did something desperate. People getting into their cars nearby turned to look. I stood there frozen as she kept going, saying I could have just shared my room from the start, that I could have helped Victoria decorate instead of making everything a competition. Then her voice broke and she started sobbing, saying she was terrified of losing Victoria, that watching her daughter trapped in a body that didn't work was killing her, that she couldn't handle the guilt of encouraging Victoria, and that she didn't know how to fix any of this. She was crying and saying sorry, but I didn't know if she was apologizing to me, Victoria, or herself. I stood awkwardly with my arms at my sides, not knowing if I should hug her or back away. Dad gently took Rebecca's elbow and guided her to the car. After we had dinner, Dad called me and Rebecca into the living room for a family meeting and told us he was taking a leave of absence from work starting next week to focus on the remediation project and get trained as Victoria's caregiver. He'd already contacted a contractor about the upstairs repairs and see. He showed us the contractor's estimate and the permit timeline, walking us through each step like a project at work. Rebecca nodded along, wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue. After listening, I felt relieved that Dad was actually handling things instead of just shutting down. I took a breath and told Dad and Rebecca that I would help with Victoria's care and house repairs, but I wasn't going to be the only caregiver or the family's punching bag anymore. My voice was calm but firm, like I was drawing a line in the sand. I told them I'd do my part, but I also had school and college applications and my own life to consider. Dad nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. Rebecca looked away toward the window but didn't argue or protest, just sat there quietly. It wasn't a big emotional moment or a breakthrough, just a simple statement of boundaries. 2 days later, Lucas Harper returned with the nursing schedule printed on official letterhead. He explained that a professional aide would cover 8 o'clock to 8 o'clock every day, and family members would split the overnight shifts. He took a tablet Victoria could control with her eye movements and a better speaking valve that worked better with her ventilator out of his luggage and spent an hour teaching us how to set up the eye-gazing software and speaking valve. As the medical equipment was arranged and the new technology made things less dreary, the garage became more like a functioning living area. Lucas left information about paralysis support groups and trauma therapists on the kitchen counter and told Dad to call him if we needed anything else. The next week, Jason Taylor returned with the approved remediation plan in a thick folder. He explained that a licensed contractor would install proper support beams upstairs to replace the one that collapsed and repair all ceiling damage. Jason explained the permit process and inspection schedule, marking dates on a calendar he left with us. Dad signed all the forms at the kitchen table, his signature steady this time. The garage window would be framed and weatherproofed to code, making it legal. The project would take 8 to 10 weeks and cost $85,000, which Dad was financing with a home equity loan. A few days later, the insurance company's final decision letter arrived in a thick envelope. Dad opened it at the kitchen table while I made coffee and watched his face as he read. I thought about how much money that was and how we'd be paying for Victoria's mistake for years. Dad's expression changed as he read the letter, which confirmed that the structural damage claim was denied due to intentional demolition and code violations, as Ethan Parker said at the meeting. The insurance company was providing an $18,000 equipment stipend for Victoria's adaptive technology and home modifications to improve accessibility. Compared to the $85,000 we'd lost, Lucas claimed it would cover a ceiling lift system to help relocate Victoria, and quieter, more dependable ventilator equipment. Dad grinned for the first time in weeks as he read that. After he showed me the letter, I felt a little hopeful that things might get better, even if they never would. That weekend, I reclaimed a small part of the garage for myself by moving some of Victoria's medical equipment to one side and clearing out a corner near the window. I also set up the shelf Dad built for me years ago against the wall. I put Mom's framed photos from our beach trip, her birthday dinner, and the silly selfie we took painting my old room pink on it, along with some of my favorite books, worn copies of fantasy novels I'd read 100 times. It was only 3 feet, but it felt like mine again. Victoria watched me through her eye gaze tablet, following my movements. I walked over to her bed and told her I wasn't trying to take over her space, just claiming a tiny corner. Her eyes blinked twice, the signal we'd worked out for yes. The next day, I brought Victoria's nail polish collection from my bathroom to her bedside. I'd set up the projector on the wall earlier and loaded one of our favorite mindless comedy movies. I pulled a chair close to her bed and took her limp hand, feeling the weight of it in mine. She couldn't feel my fingers on hers, but she could see everything in the mirror above her bed. I held up 3 bottles and she picked the pale blue. I painted each nail slowly, wiping away mistakes with remover. The movie played in the background, but neither of us watched it. After finishing her left hand, I moved to her right, choosing a sparkly silver because her eyes fell on it. We didn't talk much, just existed in the same space without anger or blame. It felt like the first peaceful moment we'd shared in months. Victoria's voice was thin and mechanical through her speaking valve. She told me she wanted the attention and admiration my garage room got because she felt invisible in the family and thought a dramatic room transformation would make her special. She said she didn't mean for this to happen, but she didn't apologize. I put down the nail polish and looked in the mirror. I told her I was sorry she felt invisible, but what happened wasn't my fault. I understood wanting to feel special and want people to notice her, but she made her own choices with the sledgehammer that day, and I couldn't take responsibility for them. I told her I would assist because she was family, but I couldn't change the past. We had to live with what occurred now, and the only way ahead was being honest about what we could and couldn't give one another. Dad changed after the insurance letter arrived. He bought a huge wall calendar with big squares for each day and hung it in the kitchen. He spent an evening filling it in with different colored markers. Blue for nursing shifts, green for Victoria's therapy appointments, red for permit inspections, and purple for my school schedule. Rebecca entered the kitchen while Dad was working on it and suggested moving my dentist appointment to avoid conflict with Victoria's physical therapy. Dad agreed and thanked her. She volunteered to coordinate morning nursing if Dad worked evening hours. It wasn't warm or pleasant, but it was the first time I'd seen them work together in weeks. 2 months after the police station meeting, the contractor completed the first significant milestone. After installing the new support beams upstairs, the ceiling was structurally sound again. Jason Taylor inspected the work for an hour with his clipboard and measuring tools before coming downstairs to tell us it passed. Viv, he said he was reducing our remaining fines to $2,000 because we were actively following the remediation plan. Dad framed the inspection approval certificate like a diploma and hung it in the hallway. I understood why when I saw him look at it later that night. It was proof we were repairing and moving forward. During my lunch breaks at school, I researched colleges with strong disability support services to help me understand Victoria's situation. I narrowed it down to schools within an hour of home so I could help her while building my own life. Dad discovered me at the kitchen table one night with printouts and helped me fill out the applications. He read my essay on family issues and stated he was proud of me for not giving up on my future. While working together, I realized I could be part of this family and still have boundaries, goals, and dreams. 3 months after the collapse, our house settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal on good days. Victoria had a nursing aide who covered most of the day and family members who split the night shifts. The upstairs repairs were 60% complete, with the contractor working every weekday on the ceiling and walls. Money was tight and would be for years, with the home equity loan payment on Dad's bank statement every month. Family relationships were still fragile, and Rebecca and Dad's conversations were still careful and formal. But we had systems, and everyone was trying in their own way. We were all still attempting to cope with the repercussions of choices taken in rage, fear, and desperation. There were no heroes or villains in this narrative.